correct? Let me
Yep.
see.
Could you try now?
Yeah, I'm gonna try again. Here it is, share, and can you see this?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I wanted to spend, 15, 20 minutes to tell you a little bit about my work over the past years. I've been looking at climate change with a particular eye to food systems, and that is the way we use land and sea, and how that is responsible for, climate change, and what can we do through our diets, but also through production to make sure that doesn't happen anymore or is drastically reduced. So I would like to start with something about a common mantra, which is that climate change is primarily caused by the way we burn fossil fuel, which of course is true, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. So I'd like you to look at these two charts. First, start with the one on the left. That's a graph from, the World Resources Institute here in DC, which looks at sectors as partitioned by the IPCC, which is an Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And here you can see that energy is indeed responsible for a large share of emissions. We're just talking about emissions at the moment, greenhouse gas emissions, which cause global warming. And then agriculture is responsible for about 19% of all emissions. And you have little, indications of how that's subpartitioned. And then the residual 8.5% of all emissions come from waste and industry. But this partition of sectors by the IPCC does not correspond to a partitioning of sectors in economic terms. To do the economic partitioning, you end up with recent studies by Kripa and others, these are all published in Science that and Nature, that show that the system of food, for the production of food and consumption of food, is actually responsible for a larger share. Kripa et al. Put that at 34% of all emissions, if you consider not just production in green, but also the waste from food systems and the use of land, so how we change, alter the crust of the earth to produce, transport, packaging, etc., retail. And the IPCC has a special report 2019, which puts food systems at 37% of all emissions currently. The expectation and estimates by the Eat Lancet report 2019 are that food systems will be responsible for 50%, that is half of all emissions, by 2050 because of population growth and dietary shifts. So you could actually compute for the food system something called the carbon equivalent budget. That means how much other emissions can we emit if we leave food systems like this and then hit the 1.5 Celsius target that we have under Paris. And that's what we get. If you look at the bar here, the blue bar at the top, a business as usual scenario. So if we don't change the way we produce and consume food, would bring us basically 3 times beyond the 1.5. You have here these 4 lines, these 4 vertical lines. At the bottom, you read 1.5 C limit. That's a 67 chance of being within this 1.5. We would trespass that, of course, by 210, 3 times. And we would basically get very close to our chance to stay within 67%. We would have 67% chance to stay within 2%, 2 Celsius relative to pre-industrial levels in terms of global temperature increases. That means if we just continue to produce food as we do and eat it as we do, at the end of the century, we'd only have 49 billion tons of CO2 spared from all food sectors. That's not 49 billion tons in 1 year. It's 49 billion tons to be spread over 80 years. That's between now and 2100. So, we really need to do something about this because even if we stopped burning fossil fuel tomorrow, which of course is impossible. Food systems alone would drag the planet into this very unstable equilibria planetary, well beyond our planetary boundaries. So okay. The main problem with food systems comes from meat and dairy, because if you look at a breaking up of greenhouse gas emissions from meat, the meat we raise, the animals that we raise to consume, to kill and eat, a lot has to do with a lot of the emissions from the food systems come from meat, especially beef, farm prawns, but also lamb and goat and pork. And of course, dairy, because it requires, animals like cows to be around and goats and so forth. So here you have a nice chart on this, which also separate some of the two different greenhouse gases, CO2 equivalent gases like methane and CO2. And in part, the reason is that these animals emit methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas, but in part it's also because they're big animals. They need to eat a lot, and when you need to eat a lot, you need a lot of land to either graze upon or to grow crops that you can consume. And so you can see here in dark black the land use for livestock and fish farms. So it take almost half of all the land that we can use on the planet for feeding ourselves. So it's a very inefficient way of feeding ourselves, because we basically use a lot of land and gases to feed animals that we then eat, but that give us less protein, less calories than we'll get by directly eating the food produced using that land. Dietary change is a very powerful way to reduce emissions, and there are studies now, science concurs in showing that when you move from diets which are heavy in animal food to diets that are less heavy in animal food, you can reduce an enormous amount of these emissions, and you can actually release back to the wild a lot of land. This is the green part of these bars, and that absorbs carbon. So you can actually invert some of the trends in emissions that we're seeing. Of course, vegan is a very extreme diet, but you can see how it does the job, and even a no meat nor dairy diet can go a long way. So vegetarian, partly vegetarian diet, or can go a long way in achieving some of these results. There's something very important that people don't mention, which is when they talk about this dichotomy between working on energy and alone as a solution to all our woes, is that burning fossil fuels emits CO2, that's carbon dioxide, but the gases that are emitted by agricultural and sea use for production of food are much more potent. So agriculture not only produces CO2 through deforestation, but also CH4, which is methane, and NO2, which is nitrous oxide. These two gases are the most potent greenhouse gases. So they're the best in a perverse sense at trapping heat. And in fact, the global warming potential, GWP, of methane is 34 times CO2 over 100 years and 86 times over 20 years. And for nitrous oxide, those numbers are 298 and 268. So Allen et al. In Oxford Martin School have studied a redefinition of GWP for Paris Agreement purposes, and they say we should weigh better these gases and what they mean for our ability to reduce emissions in the short run, because we only have a very short time period to reduce emissions. So they show that, for example, this little chart here, falling emissions to the left, if we reduce CO2, that's the red line, over time, and the warming of the planet continues to go up, and then it plateaus. We can't stop this going up by reducing CO2. But if we reduce CH4, that's methane, which primarily comes from cows, and some nitrous oxide from manure of pigs, etc., we can actually cool the planet immediately. So we can really invert the process, which is what we kind of desperately need. So it's almost sense that while both energy and food system have to be addressed to stabilize the planet, the Earth system, prioritizing over time the work on food systems is preferable because you can actually stop the clock and invert, bring time back in terms of global temperatures. To reduce emissions from food is complex. I mean, there can be a number of activities that can be brought about. One is to improve, yields of abandoned lands without using pesticides. Some is to halve food waste. Healthy calories, that means people that eat too much should eat, what they need, and people that eat too little should eat a little bit more. That will reduce 30% of emissions by itself. Improve farm practices by lowering the intensity of emissions, and then moving to a more plant-rich diet, not necessarily vegan, but reduce meat for sure. If we could do 50% of these 5 changes, we could reduce emissions by 63%. If we do them all together, we could actually go into negative territory and reduce emissions 100% and also sequester some emissions. Problem with food systems is not just emissions, unfortunately. There's food systems are the prime cause of destruction of soils, rainforest, air, and water. I don't have much time, but we estimate that by 2050, 90% of the soil, which is the most precious thing we have because it enables the planet to produce plants through chemical reactions, and those plants we either eat or feed to the animals. 90% could become degraded. Rainforests are disappearing. Fresh water is mostly polluted, and air, of course, is full of ammonia and other products that we shouldn't even think of breathing. So the situation is a bit desperate. And of course, biodiversity is a big victim of agriculture. Agriculture and land use and sea use are the #1 cause of biodiversity loss by far. We have basically replaced, here's a little chart with the cow, all wild animals on the planet, of which only 4% left, with farmed animal and ourselves. And the rate at which we're now losing species, since 1970s, this black bar, we're losing something in the order of 54,000 species a year. Whereas over the past 400 years, before 1970, we lost 800 species. Now we're losing 54,000 every year. That's several times the background rate, the normal rate of species lost. And last but not least, of course, food that we produce doesn't go to the right people, and a lot of it is lost. So there's a lot of people that are overweight or obese, a lot of people that are underweight, stunted, iron deficient of all the population. And about 1/3 of all food is lost, either lost or wasted. So we are trashing our planet for food that nobody eats. Some scary food math is that by 2050, we need to double food production because population growth, we expect to have 2 billion more people on the planet. And because people want to eat more, people that never had meat and dairy want that. And also because we might need biofuels that need to be, harvested on our land. But we may lose half of food supply because of climate change, which leads to temperature that create thermal shocks for plants, soil erosion, water scarcity, and troubled farmers. So we're risking really a global food and water crisis going forward. There's also massive economic costs the way we produce food. Because of diets, zoonosis, antimicrobial resistance, and the social costs of carbon affect GDP, our fiscal spending, private debt, and natural capital depreciation. Natural capital is an asset. So the more we destroy it, of course, the more we lose that value. And here's a quick calculation. We spend about 3% taking care medically of people that are overweight, obese. Just for COVID, which has originated in, some viruses that were in the wild, we have spent 19% of global world product. the way we feed animals that we farm with antibiotics is leading potentially to a mega crisis of antibiotic resistance, which would cost us 3.5% a year in global war product. And then loss of biodiversity or natural capital costs us something like 4% a year in global war product. So this, we're really losing a third of our global war product every year to doing things the wrong way. Last but not least, countries that are now eroded soils like China, Saudi Arabia, and part already now the US, started becoming importers of food. And this is a security risk from a foreign policy point of view. So they went out and bought land in a lot of countries, mostly continents like Africa and South America. And they're called large-scale land acquisitions. They buy, millions of acres to produce food for themselves or biofuels. But these countries are full of people that are still hungry and they need that land for themselves. So here you have, the hunger index. The higher the hunger index, the more important the share of agriculture is a share of GDP. So it's also a source of income. And also, however, the bigger the land acquisitions in those lands. And the problem is that where land acquisition happened, these are the blue and purple dots here to the right map, is exactly where we have the last parts of global terrestrial diversity of vertebrates. So we are really pounding on biodiversity loss. Prices skyrocketing and food prices are going up because there's scarcity now everywhere. So farmland is the new gold. This is the dashed line. It's beat any commodity. If you invest in farmland, you're a rich person. And 10 years ago, you made a lot of money. And food prices globally are going up at a really fast rate, which makes people on fixed income have a hard time feeding themselves. What can we do as a policymakers and economic policy? A lot of things, because it's economic policies that cause this mess. Here's an example: the U.S. The U.S. Gives subsidies, fiscal money, tax money, back to farmers to produce grains and meat. These grains go mostly here, the middle chart, to feeding animal or to produce ethanol to do gasoline for cars. And this system of subsidies leads to a distribution of prices you see here on the very right, where fruits and vegetables, the healthy diet, backbone, are the most expensive products, whereas grains and meat are the cheapest ones. So guess where people are buying? People are buying, grains and meat and dairy, and that's their food primarily, and a lot of processed food. We can act on these 4 levers: supply, demand, food waste, and conservation. And the bunch of policy measures I discussed in the book, from taxes to credits to public investment, green and blue funds, to marine protected areas and environmental tax that we can work with to create jobs and save food systems and make them healthy, affordable, and equitable. So this is the book that Julian was talking about. I'm happy to take your questions. Just concluding, food systems are broken, but if we address them, we can mitigate emissions. We can actually reverse warming, and we can make the world resilient to future shocks. We can hit all the planetary boundaries with addressing food systems. That what Johan Rockström said in his new documentary with David Attenborough, Breaking Boundaries, just come out on Netflix. It's policies that cause the mess, but if we change those policies, we can, quickly redress the system. We need innovation, but from private sectors, but we also need public policy. And I hope I got your interest and your appetite to know more. And you have some questions, but I know we're gonna move on to others. I think I stopped sharing successfully, Julian.
Yes, you have. We can see you now
Right.
on the
Thank you.
right
Sorry
screen.
for taking so long. Thank you.
No worries, no worries. We've got about 4 minutes for just any questions. If anyone wants to ask a question, please put your hand up or put it in the chat, or feel free to do anything. But I guess my question, and this is just going to be a common question, is what are you hoping that comes out of COP26, which literally starts next week? What are the key outputs you, from your own background, think need to be hit if we are to make that 1.5 degree target change?
Well, I'm very hopeful for COP26, but I also hear a lot of, disappointment. Usually I look at what the NGOs say, which are more, the frankest, uh, debriefers on the situation. I see, that it's very tricky politically, even, the big polluters like the US and China and to some extent Europe with the farm to fork policies to make really inroads into the things I've just described. A lot of excuses, a lot of reasons why, things cannot, be talked about, done. But the COP26 is hosting a number of events that are going to talk a lot about, including all the things I mentioned, but also bring to the list another thing which is important, which is the financing of the transition of food systems, because that's very important. So I'm going to be taking part to some of these events. You can rest assured there's some people that are very determined to make this happen. And they spend their, from dawn to dusk using their brain, which usually are very smart, to push the agenda in this direction. So, we should all try to contribute, and it's a joint effort. Of course, policymakers will, they're already there in their big buildings, and they think about re-election all the time. So we need to make a movement also from below, from sideways, any way we can. So you guys, you're the new tomorrow. So thinking about this, studying it, and becoming advocates is really important, independently what COP26 attains.
Well, thank you, thank you, thank you. That's really powerful, and it's also really true. I think something that also was shed light for me, which was quite new, is just the land acquisition problem you presented in your slides, and how big countries are actually buying land in other countries. What do you think is the mechanism for this? Because I know the population is going up. Is there any solution to how we can handle this in the long term and continue to provide food for people?
The land acquisition happens in countries that have very weak land tenure. So where people don't own the land because it's traditionally just work the land, and your generations had it before. It's a given. You think that that land doesn't belong to you, but you're entitled to leave. And so Africa, South America, it's like with the Native Americans. They had their land was theirs until someone came and put a flag on it. And so working on governance and land tenure is important. Working on unveiling and bringing to the fore this phenomena is important. And there are organizations that map these purchases, working, with these countries to make sure that there is no corruption and their inclusion in the discussions of the sale of land, so that, it's not just the, the village chief, but the community that can be part of the decision, also in terms of compensation. But more generally, working with the countries that are buying to make sure that their soil and their water, gets regraded, gets, reconstituted, so that they can operate in their own land to feed themselves instead of going and, just taking other people's land. I think that's also, it's a joint strategy.
No, thank you, thank you.
You're
That's
muted.
quite informed. Am I? Oh, no, thank you, thank you. That was very informative and great. Again, if you guys have any questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll try and put some time at the end to just ask Nicoletta. But right now we're going to transition into Brian, um, who is going to talk a little bit about his own experiences and how we can more or less reduce our own footprint. So over to you.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much to the organizers and Nicoletta. That was an excellent presentation. I learned a couple of things too, which I always enjoy and appreciate. I'm also going to share my slide and presentation here. So let me try that. Share screen. All right. So yes, you can hear me, right? Thumbs up.
Yep, we can hear you.
Good. I'm Brian Kateman. I'm president and co-founder of the Reductarian Foundation. Reductarian Foundation is a nonprofit organization that's focused on reducing consumption, societal consumption of animal products in order to create a more sustainable, healthy, and compassionate world. And what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about how the Reductarian movement got started and why I think it's a useful framework for having discussions around food. So I grew up in Staten Island, New York. And if you're familiar with New York and familiar with the 5 boroughs, New York is not thought of as being, Staten Island is not thought of as being a particularly progressive place. There's not a lot of swanky plant-based restaurants. I didn't know any vegans or vegetarians growing up or anything like that. It's often called the forgotten borough. But one of the things I loved about Staten Island was that there was a lot of nature, a lot of natural trails, green spaces, places where I came to really care about the environment and also the animals that were living in those wild spaces. And so when I got to college, I was kind of that card-carrying environmentalist. I would tell everyone I could that they should consider taking shorter showers and recycling and stop using plastic bottles, and they should walk instead of drive, and they should compost, and on and on and on. It wasn't until later in college that I was part of an undergraduate course on climate change where I made the connection to food. I was actually traveling from New York to Montana, United States, to present some undergraduate research. And I swear this is true. You have to imagine I'm on the plane. I've ordered like the meal or the lunch has been brought over to me and it's a hamburger. I'm eating the hamburger. And my friend, I think in a sincerity, hands me a book called The Ethics of What We Eat by Peter Singer and Jim Mason. And I remember sort of reading this book and eating the hamburger, and it really shifted my perspective in a dramatic way because I had never really thought about my food choices. I didn't know, much of what Nicoletta shared earlier about how the way we raise, particularly animals for food, accelerates climate change and deforestation and biodiversity loss and the depletion of natural resources and so on. But what I also didn't know was that these animals, who are no different from Toby and Cooper, who are embodied behind me, are put in these very cruel conditions. Pigs unable to turn around, chickens unable to open their wings, to be trapped in cages, and same with many versions of fish farming. And of course, growing up, I ate at McDonald's and Burger King. If it was a special occasion, we'd go to Applebee's and Chili's and IHOP and so on. Eating too many animal products is not good for people's health. The average person does not eat enough fruits and vegetables. And so it's going to increase the risk of heart disease and certain kinds of cancers and diabetes and obesity, hypertension, and so on. And so, I'm the kind of person who wants to live a life that's in line with my values. And so it took me a little bit of time, but I remember thinking about that book and I was like, I'm going to do the sensible thing. I'm going to go vegetarian on my way to being vegan. And for the most part, that worked out. I mean, I felt very happy to be living what I felt like was a sort of most moral, sustainable lifestyle. I had a lot of energy, sort of less heaviness in my stomach. Even some of my acne cleared up now that I wasn't eating so many fried, fatty, fast food kind of foods. But it was hard. And the reason it was hard is that I'm a person. And like most people, I don't choose food intuitively based on ethics or sustainability or even my own health. I, like most people, choose food primarily based on price, on taste and convenience, and to some extent, social norms, what other people are eating around me. And so living in Staten Island, where there's a lot of, delicious, highly inexpensive, convenient meat products, and perhaps fewer plant-based meals around, it was a little bit challenging. But the times where it was most challenging were in the context of social situations. I remember one Thanksgiving, for example, being with my family. Can imagine at a table, my dad and my sister and my aunt and uncle and cousins. And I have a really big plate of veggies, right? I've sort of taken as many as I can. I fit them on this plate. And my dad, he's like, come on, Brian, like it's Thanksgiving. You got to have some turkey. And I just felt pressure, I guess. And I don't know, maybe I missed eating turkey. And so I popped a piece of turkey in my mouth, small piece. And as, you know, for anyone here who has siblings and kind of has, you know, maybe a rivalry going on, I remember my sister, she said, "I thought you were a vegetarian, Brian," sort of poking fun at me that I had fallen off the tofu train, as they say. And I didn't have the words to describe it at the time, but I was quite frustrated with this. The average person, let's say in the United States, eats well over 200 pounds of meat a year per person. In 2020, it was the highest in recorded history, 225 pounds of meat a year. And it's very similar for nations in the developed world, and of course, increasing in developing nations. But I was not eating 200 pounds of meat a year. I was eating like 5 pounds of meat a year. It didn't make sense to be giving me flack when I was like trying. I was doing my best when I was surrounded by people who couldn't care at all. They weren't trying at all. They were just eating meat constantly, like the average person. I had another experience where I was out to breakfast with some friends, and a friend of mine had ordered bacon. And I remember he left a piece of bacon over, and as the waiter came to take the plate away, I was like, "Wait, no." And I grabbed that piece of, you know, bacon and I threw it in my mouth. And as someone who identifies as a Jewish vegetarian, for those of you who know Jews are not supposed to eat bacon, it adds another layer of humor to this. But all this is to say that I was just kind of tired of, you know, being pigeonholed into the vegetarian label when that really wasn't what it was about for me. My goal was to try to eat as many plant-based foods as possible, because I knew those foods on average were going to be kinder to the planet, kinder to animals, and kinder to my body. It was very simple. And more to the point, I was just tired of being called things like a cheating vegetarian or lazy vegetarian or even a drunkatarian. There's a term for people who, when they have alcohol on occasion, right? And you see that, you know, 2 a.m., you want the hamburger, drunkatarians. There were some words, though, to describe my diet. Semi-vegetarian, flexitarian, mostly vegetarian. All of these words describe people who primarily eat plant-based foods with the occasional inclusion of animal products in their diet. And that certainly described my diet. So that's cool. But there were a couple problems with these words. One is that they sound sort of behaviorally inconsistent, morally hypocritical. As I would meet vegans, you know, they would joke with me and say, "Oh, you're a flexitarian, so you're sort of flexible about your moral standards. When there's any amount of inconvenience, you have no problem, you know, caving in and engaging in animal cruelty, for example." Semi-vegetarian, mostly vegetarian, it emphasizes a kind of, I don't know, flexibility that some people might take as a good thing, being flexible, but in the context of a moral issue, even in the context of mitigating the climate crisis, it can invoke feelings of division and moral incompatibility. And so my friend and I, who were having conversations about this, realized, you know, there's really a need for a movement and a word to describe people, not necessarily even like myself, who very rarely eat animal products, but for the average person who's eating well over 200 pounds of meat a year, and encourage them to move in a slightly more plant-forward direction, cut back by 10% or 20%. Because if lots of people cut back on animal products by a small percentage, that would actually have a greater impact, arguably, than getting a small number of highly committed people to go vegan or vegetarian. And so you may not think we spent a lot of time thinking about what word to come up with to describe someone who was trying to reduce their consumption of animal products, but we did. And eventually we landed on what felt like a sort of simplicity, reducitarian. And reducitarian was meant to be a word to describe anyone who was actively cutting back on the amount of animal products that they consume. And it was meant to really unite perspectives, right? Because vegans and vegetarians and pescatarians and flexitarians and so on, all of these people are reducitarians. They are people who have either entirely or significantly reduced their consumption of animal products. But again, my goal and our goal wasn't necessarily to get people to be perfect or pure or to get to zero. The goal was to take the average person, quite frankly, like my father, who was never in any imaginary world was going to go vegetarian or vegan, not going to happen, meat potatoes kind of guy, right? But could be potentially convinced to occasionally include more veggies and fruits in their diets. So what I want to do now is tell you about the 4 kind of core key messages that we have around the reducitarian message. The first, which I've touched upon, is that it's not all or nothing. Most people think of meat consumption as an all or nothing premise, that you're either a vegan or you're not. We know that this is not true. We know that every single meal we have, every bite of food we have, every action that we take is an opportunity to make a choice, and it could be a kind choice to the planet. So anytime we're presented with that choice, we have the option to have a meal that may be vegan or vegetarian, or even more plant forward, let's say 80% veggies and 20% meat or something like that. And that's going to be a big win for the planet, animals, our bodies, and so on. Vegan food is not just for vegans. I've had the experience of going into a restaurant and ordering the sort of vegan item on the menu, and the waiter, being very friendly and kind, nothing interesting intended, would say to me, "Oh, are you vegan?" And I remember thinking how funny that question was, because it sort of implies that in order to eat a vegan meal, you have to be vegan, or the reason a person would choose a vegan meal is because they're vegan. I just got married, not just pre-pandemic, 2 years ago, and our sort of catering was vegan, right? The menu. And I remember my mom being terrified because the word vegan is very triggering for her. I remember she said, and I quote, "What are the people who don't eat that kind of food going to eat?" Meaning, vegan food is not for vegans, let alone the number of people who enjoy guacamole and margaritas, for example, on a given day, and that's vegan. So we need to move away from this idea of this division of the vegan omnivore divide and really focus on the idea that it's definitely not an all or nothing premise. And we see this in the context of strategies that people can use to cut back on animal products. So you can do Meatless Monday, where you're not eating meat on Monday. You can do Graham Hill's approach, which is weekday vegetarian. As he says, nothing with a face, Monday through Friday. You can do Mark Bittman's approach, vegan before 6, breakfast and lunch is vegan, but dinner, it's your choice, or you can be vegetarian or vegan. But all of these strategies emphasize this idea that it's not all or nothing, that it puts us on a continuum. And of course, the same can be thought of at an institutional level. So I think, as Nicoletta has maybe implied at times, that it's not just about individual responsibility, right? There are many institutions and entities that can help move this, politicians and so on, that can move this direction. And we have to be mindful that it's not all or nothing there either. So restaurants can simply offer one vegan option, and that might be an improvement, or a food service in the context of a cafeteria at a hospital or a school might offer some, veggie taco Tuesdays, and that would be a really big win. We can innovate on plant-based ingredients with food technology. Many of you may have heard of Beyond Meat or Impossible Foods, innovations that embody the taste and texture and mouthfeel of meat, but come from plant-based sources. We can work on improving the welfare of animals in these environments. If we're going to eat them, let's not make it torture, right? Let's give them some space. Let's give them access to sunlight. And in truth, that often can have the result of increasing costs slightly, which can be passed on to the consumer, which in turn may lower meat consumption, because as we talked about earlier, price is a major driver of consumption. And we can encourage people to allocate more of their philanthropy and investment in the space. A lot of money goes toward fossil fuels, and that's important because fossil fuels is a major concern as it relates to the climate crisis. But as we heard in the previous presentation, there's a huge impact going on in the context of food. So shifting additional funding to food is an important perspective that we take. And of course, vote for people who care about food. Design legislation that allows for some of these transitions toward a more plant-based food system. And just to drive this point home again, getting a person who eats 200 pounds of meat a year to cut back 10% is a bigger impact than getting someone like me who eats a couple pounds of meat a year to go fully vegetarian. So we really advocate that people let go of the fixations on perfection, purity, absolutism. May be very useful in a philosophy classroom. There might be really good moral reasons for something, but in the context of actually trying to make change, it's a very, very silly proposition in my view. The second is that incremental change is worthy of celebration. Some people may be inspired to make these changes overnight. Others may take time, and that's okay. So this is the pun, right, about going cold turkey. Some people go cold turkey and others won't. So we have to be patient with people, with institutions. Yes, we at times will need to engage in, more assertive activism, but I can tell you on an individual level, very rarely has shaming worked on me. Generally, I tend not to like those kinds of people, just intuitively, not intellectually. Just my reaction is like, yeah, go away. You're judging me. It feels bad. These feelings inside of me, even if they're intellectually right or morally right. Another thing that I can draw upon is my own dad, who for many, many years, was not willing to make any changes, and recently has made some changes, which is really cool. And for those of you who have seen or might see our documentary called Meet Me Halfway, you can see my dad's very small part of it, but my dad's journey around kind of making some changes. So you can't force people to do things. Sometimes they're going to take time, and they may start by doing 10% or 20%, and who knows, they may go to 50% or 80% or even 100%. So being patient is a useful thing, and we celebrate the small positive steps that people take, rather than sort of shaming them for not being at the final destination, if there was one. The next is that all motivations matter. So in the context of this discussion, I gather that many of you care about climate change and food security and so on. That's one cause area around moving toward a more plant-based food system, but issues around, of course, animal cruelty, human health, food justice, all of these motivations provide us with an access point into consumers who may not necessarily care about the climate crisis, but may care about their health, or may care about animals, or one of those, or two of those, or so on. And that's a reflective of how lousy factory farming is. It's really one of the most cruel, inefficient, destructive systems that have ever been created. And because of that, it gives people an entry point into whatever reason they might be excited to end factory farming and move toward better farming practices in the context of animal agriculture, of course, but also plant-based food. And the last one that gets me kind of most animated is that we're all on the same team. I am tired of a vegan making fun of a vegetarian making fun of a flexitarian. I loathe when I see environmentalists and human health advocates and animal advocates fighting each other because they can't agree on this ideal post-factory farming landscape. They think they dispute and debate the ideal kinds of farming practices, whether it's regenerative agriculture or rotational grazing, or whether there's going to be animals or no animals, or whether there's going to be plant-based meat products, or whether we're only going to rely on whole foods. My reaction to that is this discussion is pointless, because 99% of animals, 99% of meat comes from factory farms. That is the problem. So we need to focus on ending that. And we don't know what's going to end that. There are many, many different strategies and tools in our toolbox. And anyone who tells you that they know the answer does not know the answer, because there are no such things as silver bullets. And we do not have enough scientific information. And the world is very complex to have any sense of absolutism that one strategy is the correct strategy. In our view, anything that moves away from factory farms, whether it be meat that comes from a high welfare regenerative farm, or plant-based meat, or even the increasingly popular idea around cell-based meat or cellular agriculture. It's in the media, it's often referred to as lab-grown meat, where you take a cell from an animal and you grow that cell rather than grow the animal. The cell is put in a nutrient-dense environment and multiplies as it would if it was in the muscle of an animal. And through that process, you get meat. All of these strategies have pros and cons. Plant-based meat doesn't taste exactly like animal-based meat. Cell-based meat is very expensive. Regenerative agriculture, while it can be useful for cultivating the soil and the land and sequestering carbon and water, it actually requires a lot more land. The one thing factory farming is very efficient at is basically stuffing as many animals as possible into a very, very small amount of space. Regenerative agriculture, because it's utilizing the land in more productive ways, it's producing way, way fewer animal products, very hard to scale. No way you could feed our nation, or any nation for that matter, especially as the developing nations progress on regenerative agriculture alone. All of these strategies have pros and cons. I don't know which is the most promising solution, but we need to fund them all and we need to invest in them all. And hopefully within our lifetimes, we'll manage to end factory farming and significantly increase consumption of plant-based foods. I'd be a terrible marketer, and I'm certainly not if I didn't include our poster from Meet Me Halfway. So I encourage folks to check out our latest project, which is a documentary, and it's on Amazon and Apple TV and Vimeo and Google Play and really anywhere you can rent a film for a couple bucks. I'm so grateful that you put on this this event, that you're part of this movement. We need lots of, I love it. Nicoletta, you said it, I'm not gonna say as good as you, you said something like, you know, you're our new tomorrow or something like that. And that resonated with me. I'm still young, but not as young as you all. So we need you to keep on doing the good fight. Be compassionate, not just toward the people that you agree with, but the people that you disagree with. And let's do what we can to transform our food system such that it's kinder to the planet and kinder to all beings, including other species, right? Not just Toby and Cooper, but pigs and chickens and fish and so on. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Again, we've got a bit of time for a couple of questions. So if you do, either put them in the chat, raise your hand and ask. But I'm just going to start off with one, and I asked Nicoletta this, and it's just like, what do you think what outcome do you want to come out of this COP26 that's literally starting just now? I think you might have touched on a few outcomes throughout your presentation, but what's the one that's most important to you or touches you the most?
The thing
No, Brian, go ahead.
Well, what that question was for me, right? Just making sure.
Yeah, but you can both answer it.
Yeah, cool. I'm definitely not an expert on the COP26, but I will say one thing I noticed is that, if I'm not mistaken, it's one of the first times that they're offering a primarily plant-based menu. If I'm not mistaken, maybe Nicoletta, you can correct me. I'm very excited about this because nothing pisses me off more than going to like a fancy gala where there's all these, you know, amazing environmentalists and then everybody's chowing down on steak. So food is still a very controversial, you know, political thing. There's this idea that it's sort of my right to choose or so on, and that's a personal choice. But I think we're starting to, you know, in the years since, we've started to break down that idea and really emphasize that we need to be emphasizing plant-based food. So I would be very excited if industrial animal agriculture was either, you know, included as part of the formal agenda, or if there were people there who were grumbling about the fact that we didn't spend enough time thinking about ending industrial animal agriculture. But I have a feeling Nicoletta would be able to shed light more on how seriously that, you know, COP26 takes my passion into account.
I mean, I agree that that's symbolic. I think it's also the first time that a COP, Conference of Party on, you know, climate change takes more serious account of food systems. In part also the attention to nature and nature-based solutions, because you need to understand that, you know, it's really a short blanket, the use of land and water. So if we use land to produce food in this very inefficient way to feed animals that are, you know, clustered into a hangar where they see no light or night, you know, we need a lot of land. And that takes away land from all the things we need to do with land to sequester carbon that we have put up into the atmosphere. So there's a red line between talking about nature conservation and talking about reforming food systems. And that's why, you know, in the book, half the book is about conservation and trying to, you know, make sure this trade-off works well. And the COP26 is the first that will bring biodiversity more into the discussion. So I'm hopeful that, you know, this is a trend now and things improve. Of course, what we all want to see is action at the country level of some significance. And there, to some extent, it's, as we were saying, it's our responsibility too, because there's a lot of you know, dragging of feet. I mean, these conferences, these galas, these reunions, you know, these meetings are only worth, you know, their words and time and money if something happens in terms of changes to policies. But I see the private sector in terms of finance being more interested in food systems people being, now being more conscious about these issues, in part because of people like Brian and wonderful documentaries and, people that talk about it, and Julian organizing this. And that is the wave, that is inescapable for policymakers, because it will hit them. Question is when, but, it will hit them, and it is happening. So it's a good call. I don't know about outcomes, but I'll be there on some meetings, and I'll make a fuss, I'll make noise. So I don't know.
Yeah, make noise. I appreciate that. And let me know if the vegan food is good. If it's not, that's the thing. It has to capture people's taste buds. So hopefully they do a good job with whatever they're offering.
I'm just virtually there. So the funny thing, I'm even invited to a dinner, but I'm virtually at the dinner. I don't know what that means, but maybe I can see what people eat and tell you about it.
Or at least make a vegan meal while you're on, while you're on the webcam. That'll you'll be there.
I already bought my edamame.
Nice.
I love that, virtually there. I guess you can virtually still enjoy the dinner. But I guess my last question for both of you is just around like one key tip that you'd want to give everyone here on just getting closer to that net zero for our own personal selves or even the wider community. One small thing that some random student writing an assignment can do to kind of ensure they get closer to this target. And they are more mindful of the waste they're having. So I don't know, Brian, you want to go first since I see your mic's open?
Yeah, I usually answer things with like beautiful philosophy, like you should be kinder to people and you should not think of all or nothing or so on. But I just want to give a very concrete tip, which is if you're struggling or people who are struggling with eating more plant-based foods, what I often tell them is to eat what they love, but integrate more plant-based foods. So for example, if you really like burritos, instead of asking for chicken, you ask for avocado. Or if you like pasta and tomato sauce, make it primavera by having veggies. Or if you like Thai or curries, Indian curries, keep that same sauce that you love, but make it one of the plant-based ingredients. So try to keep things very simple would be my suggestion from an individual perspective. Maybe Nicoletta will have a sustained global kind of strategy for us, but I wanted to go with what you put on your food tonight.
No, I don't. I like the saffron, the suggestion of no animal food before dinner. I think it's a good compromise, and it's easy because I'm Italian, so you can have bread and vegan butter if you wish, which is just margarine in the morning, or cereals with non-dairy. Then a pasta, which we usually with tomato sauce, which is basically vegan. And then you can have, whatever you want at dinner. Maybe not a kilo steak, but, just you can have animal food at dinner. And that he claims, and I think is correct, it goes really in the direction of Brian, which is reduces the mass consumption of meat tremendously. So that would be the first step. So you basically just shifting around the time when you eat animal food and confine it to dinner. And that makes it help. But just try things. Don't be shy. Some things won't taste good for you. Some things will be maybe discoveries, and you will be very affectionate to them, and they'll be one of your preferred dishes. So just be open, and remember that every spoonful or fork, it makes a difference for everybody. Animals, planet, plants, people. Everything is worth. Even if you can make one spoon difference, that will be worth.
I just say amen to that. Well said.
Well, thank you both for this insightful talk. We will be putting this on our media streams, so in case you've got friends who you think this is relevant to, do share and reshare the link, because I certainly learned quite a lot from this. So thank you both, and hopefully you have a lovely evening or day or whatever it is in what part of the world you are.
Thanks, Julian. Take care to everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Take care. Nice to meet you, both of you. Bye, everyone.